Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of videos to help you play chess better. And in these initial set of videos, we're kind of sampling all the different types of videos we can do. We've done a couple of amateur games, which I think are really important to study. We've talked about learning opening tabayas. We've talked about the last one was a series of tactical puzzles on building up a tactical ideas. Today we're going to talk about the seeds of tactical destruction. The seeds of tactical destruction are things in somebody's position that tell you that there might be a tactic against them. It's weaknesses in their position, some sort of problem that would tell you that a tactic might be possible. The rule is very simple. If your opponent has no seeds in his position, then you can have a tactic. However, if your opponent does have seeds in his position, then you may or may not have a tactic, but it's worth your time looking for it. In my book, Back to Basics Tactics, I devoted an entire chapter to this idea, and I called it something like, Is There a Tactic? And I put a whole bunch of problems in the chapter, and in every problem there was seeds of tactical destruction, but in only about half the problems did you have a tactic. And that's what happens in games. In games, if your opponent's position has no problems with it, if he's perfectly solid, then you won't have a tactic. But if he has something wrong with his position, then you might look for a tactic, and you may or may not find one. It may be there, it may not be there, and if it's there, you may not be able to find it. In puzzles, things are different. In puzzles, people tell you that there's something there, and then you just have to look for the seeds and figure out what they are and how the tactics work. I've been writing about this for many years, but interestingly enough, a few years ago, a book came out which was exactly on this subject. Of course, he didn't know about me calling it The Seeds of Tactical Destruction. So the name of the book was Chess Tactics Antenna, and its author was Emanuel Niemann, and the subtitle is Know When and Where to Look for Winning Combinations. So if you look at Niemann's book and you look for this idea of seeds of tactical destruction, which of course is the main idea of his book, in his book he calls it a signal. So his name, he didn't know what I called it, and I didn't know what he called it because I wrote about seeds of tactical destruction long before this book came out. So I call it seeds of tactical destruction. Niemann calls it signals. No matter what you call it, it's things that are wrong with someone's position that tells you there might be a tactic. So let's look at some puzzles from various sources, and we'll see if we can solve the puzzle and recognize the seeds. All right, this first puzzle is from one of my favorite basic tactics books, John Bain's Chess Tactics for Students. And I believe in most of John's books he makes up his own puzzles, but sometimes there's standard tactical puzzles that everybody uses in all the basic tactics books. In any case, this is a very typical puzzle, and this is white to play. So if it's white to play, we have to look, what's wrong with black's position? Well, white has the bishop pair, but otherwise the material is even. But one thing we can note in this position is that black has all his pieces on dark squares. That would tell us that maybe we can do something with this dark squared bishop. All right, well, the first thing we'd look at is maybe checks, captures, and threats, which would be something like rook d2 check. But you can see that's quickly going to lead to almost nothing. So the big idea would be get rid of his dark squared piece and see what we can do from there. So the answer to the puzzle is play rook takes e7. Now in a game, if you miss rook takes e7 because you say to yourself, rooks are worth more than bishops, this is an idea we've come across several times in our videos already, and it's a very, very common error. This is called acquiescence error. Acquiescence error occurs when you stop too soon. And what I see in positions like this is that everybody considers this tactics puzzle to be really easy, and yet when they see it in a game, they miss it. This is very common from people rated between 1200 and 1600. They miss tactics like this in games, but they get the puzzles right, and then they wonder why they're not that good. And a lot of times it's because they don't ask themselves, if I make this sacrifice, is there any follow-up, rather than just stopping at the sacrifice and saying, oh, rooks are worth more than bishops, I can't do that. So here the first move is rook takes e7, king takes e7, and now bishop to b4 check is not only a skewer, but it's also a removal of the guard at the same time, because the bishop on b5 is blocking the king from going to e8. So therefore, the king can't guard the bishop. The king has to move away. Bishop takes, rook wins the piece. Now, we could look at a Zwischenzug for black. After rook takes e7, suppose black plays c6. The idea being that if white just moves the bishop, then after king takes e7, white can play bishop b4 check, and then black can play king to e8. The problem with that is that white will simply play rook takes b7, and when black gets the piece back with c takes b5, white will trade off with a check. If black plays king here, we can then play check and win the rook anyway. Or we could even take the rook, take the knight, and then go queen the pawn, either way. So it turns out, after rook takes e7, whether black plays king takes e7, or whether he tries the Zwischenzug c6, he's dead lost. All right, let's look at some more puzzles and see what we can find. Examine %34. Okay, so this is white to play. And what are the seeds here? Well, one of the seeds is that if white moves this knight, there's a discovery on this diagonal. So you're always looking for your checks, captures, and threats. So white has 3 possible first moves that he could play here to try to get this discovery. He could play knight takes e6, hitting the bishop on c5 twice. He can play knight takes c6, hitting the bishop on c5 twice. Or he could play rook takes c5 first and then try a discovery on the queen. All right, well, let's try each one and see what happens. Well, if we play knight takes e6, black cannot just recapture because he loses not only the bishop but also the exchange as well. But black won't do that. He'll play bishop takes e3, hitting the queen. And if white wants to save the queen, then black will take the knight, and white doesn't get anything. A little bit more tricky is knight takes c6. Now if bishop takes e3, white can save the knight with knight check, followed by taking the bishop. So bishop takes e3 doesn't work. But unfortunately for white, black can play rook takes e3, which guards the bishop on c5. And now if you've done a lot of problems like this, you realize you don't want to take with the bishop because that just trades things off. What you want to do is pin the rook and then add pressure to this pin. The problem is, where can white go to add pressure? If he plays queen to d4, black will just guard the rook with rook fd8. If he plays rook c1, black will play rook takes c1 check, and white doesn't have time to take the queen because he's in check. So there's no way to really increase the pressure on this rook, and all white will do is get his exchange back, and he won't win material. So this is a very good try, but it doesn't quite work. However, the third possibility, rook takes c5, is the one that's going to take the best advantage of the seed. Because if black wants to not lose the material, he's got to make a capture. He's either got to play knight takes knight, in which case white has some nice possibilities here. White could play bishop takes, and then if rook takes, now he can add more pressure with maybe queen to e3. On knight takes, he could also, let's see here, he could also play rook takes c8, knight takes f3 check, g takes f3, and now black doesn't have time to play rook takes c8 because of bishop takes b6 and white's winning. All right, black could also play queen takes c5, and now knight takes e6 hits the queen 2 different ways, and black can't capture either one without losing the queen. So what's going to happen after queen takes c5, knight e6 is not only will white get the 2 pieces for the rook, but he's also forking the queen and the rook on f8. So when the queen is saved with some move like queen to e7 or something, white can play knight takes f8 and end up an entire piece ahead. Okay, let's get to the next one. 47. Okay, so what's the seed here? Well, there's two seeds. One is this rook on b7 is pinned to the queen. It looks like it's not because he's threatening rook takes g7, but if we could just fix it so that if that rook moves off the b file, white can play rook takes a7 check, then white's got a pin on that rook. Also, the black king is very, very awkward here. There's possible checkmates. So the big seeds here would be to either pin the rook on b7 or simply make a quiet move with the queen that threatens something. And the quiet move that looks like it's worth the most is queen to e8, a move that most people wouldn't look at right away. The idea of queen e8 is to tie down this rook so that if rook takes g7, queen to b5 is checkmate. And right away we can see that black's in trouble. If he moves the rook along the second rank, the b file, to guard b5, he loses the queen. That's the point of the pin. But he's a little bit in zugzwang here. For instance, if he plays queen to b6, then queen takes a4 check, queen a5, queen takes a5 check, king takes a5, rook takes b7. What else can black do? Black's kind of stuck for moves here. If he plays king to b6, then queen b5 is checkmate right away. On most moves, black is, let's say he plays queen to b8. White has lots of ways to win this position. For instance, he could play queen takes a4 check, king to b6, queen to b5 check, king to a7, queen a5 checkmate. So it looks like this quiet move, queen e8, is going to win. And the whole idea is that black's a little bit in zugzwang. The threat of queen takes a4 check is monstrous, and it just can't be met. If black plays king to a5, then white has, let's see, what's the best way to play against that? Computer says, continue with your zugzwang idea with queen to c6. Hitting the rook twice and the king can't guard it anymore. And again, the rook can't take on g7 due to queen b5 mate, and all these mates are unstoppable. All right, let's ask the computer if queen c8 would also win. Queen c8, computer says, yeah, but it's not as good. It says queen b6, queen a8 check, rook a7, rook a7 check, queen a7, queen c6 check, queen b6, queen a4 check, queen a5. And white's up a pawn with a nice game, but it's nothing like queen e8. Okay, next puzzle. We're looking for seeds in every puzzle. All right, the next puzzle is a little different. And this puzzle is very instructive. This is white to play. This is what I call a defensive puzzle. People are very good at offensive puzzles, white to play and win, white to play and draw when he's losing. This is really white to play and not lose. And again, the seeds of tactical destruction come in, but now the seeds of tactical destruction are our own seeds. What are the seeds that white has in his position that's going to cause him to fall apart? What it is it's this knight on g4 with the queen coming in the diagonal. And if you've done a lot of tactical puzzles, you'll recognize this one as setting up Philidor's legacy. Philidor's legacy is that let's say white does nothing here. Let's say white plays, rook on a to c1. Then we've got queen checks, king h1, knight f2 check, king g1, knight h3 check, king h1, queen g1 check, rook takes g1, knight f2 smothered mate. That's called Philidor's legacy, that combination. Well, how do we stop that? If we play rook to f1 and he plays queen checks, king here, knight checks, the same thing's going to happen unless we sacrifice the exchange here, and that's losing the exchange. We're not just sacrificing it, and white's going to be just down the exchange for nothing. Similarly, a move like rook to d2 doesn't work for the same kind of reason. For instance, queen b6 check. And now if he plays king to f1, we don't have queen f2 mate anymore, but we've got all kinds of dangerous checks. Let's see which one the computer says is the best. Computer says just play queen e3, threatening knight takes h2 checkmate, and this game is down the drain. Okay, so rook d2 doesn't work, but what does? It turns out because of white's seeds in his position, he needs to play a defensive move. So once he recognizes what the seeds are, the only defensive move that doesn't lose material and stops queen b6 check is queen a5. So that's the answer to the puzzle. The answer to the puzzle is white to play and not lose. The answer is play queen a5. This is very practical. In real games, you don't always have play and win positions, but you have lots of play and not lose positions where you have to make a safe move. And here, because of the obvious seeds of the Philidor's legacy for black, you have to stop it, and nothing else works. For instance, let's do h3. Queen checks, king here, knight checks, and now, yeah, you're not mating him because of king h2, but you're losing the exchange again. So the only move that doesn't lose is to play queen a5, and this is using it inside out, using the reverse way, which is we're using the seeds against ourselves to see what the problem is and try to fix the problem so we don't lose. Very, very practical, very common. All right, we got time for a couple more. Let's do number 61. A lot of these puzzles are either out of my students' games or out of basic tactics books. All right, here we go. This is from a game, I think. All right, so this is a much harder puzzle, but I spotted the idea right away. What's the seeds of tactical destruction? Well, number one seed is the white king is very exposed and the black queen is hovering in the area. The number two seed is that there's possible forks between these two squares. So what can black do? Well, what black can do is eliminate the defender on that square and then start threatening the mating ideas. So if I remember right, I didn't give this to the computer recently, I think the answer is you take that knight to destroy the guard, and when he takes back, you just simply play bishop f3. And now the threat is knight takes g2 check, followed by queen takes h3 and mate. And there's really no defense to that. For instance, let's say white plays rook to g1. I'll get the computer to help me with the move order here. Well, but now the rook was guarding f2, so queen takes f2 check, rook g2, queen takes g2 is mate. All right, so he can't do that. He has to keep guarding here. Clearly, he can't take the bishop because of knight takes f3 check, winning the queen. And in fact, after bishop takes knight takes check, king here, knight d2, white king's still in trouble besides losing the queen. But what else can white play? If he plays queen to e1 to guard this square, then we've got the pattern that we were talked about before. Knight takes g4 check, which is a sneaky pin. The sneaky pin is when you attack squares that a pin piece is not really guarding. You want to train your eye to see these sneaky pin moves. Knight takes g4 check, sneaky pin as named by Charles Hertan. King to g1, and now simply just queen takes h3, threatening two different mate and ones, and there's no defense to both. For instance, bishop takes f3, queen h2 checkmate. So in this position, the idea is you remove the guard, and then you block the bishop from guarding g4, and that bishop on f3 cannot be taken. And meanwhile, white just doesn't have time. Queen to d1, knight takes g4 check, king to g1, queen takes h3, bishop f3, queen h2 checkmate. So the idea is you give the pseudo sacrifice followed by bishop f3. And I solved this problem. This was a, I don't know if this is a problem or this is a student's game, but I saw this really fast. It's kind of like, that's the first thing I'm going to look at is, can I take that knight and then try to set up something? I can't play rook takes d2, queen takes d2, knight f3 check because the bishop stops the fork. But if I play bishop f3, he can't take it for the same reason. And all of a sudden, my threat of knight g4 check is just humongous. All right, let's go to the next one. That was number 61. Let's try 69. Okay, this is again, let's see, is this from, I'm trying to remember if this is from Bain's book, or I think it might not be from Bain's book. It might be from Reinfeld's book, 1001 Combinations and Sacrifices. So what are the seeds of tactical destruction? Well, the queen on c6 is only guarded by the knight. The knight is only guarded by the king. And the rook has access to the king. So we just have to add the possible move orders together to figure out what's the right way to take advantage of this. So let's say we start with bishop takes e7 to remove the guard. That would work great if he takes back and lets me take the queen. But suppose he takes the queen first. We would love to checkmate him here with rook d8, but the bishop is unfortunately going to be taken, and winning the exchange would not be enough to lose the queen. And if we play bishop f6, setting up the mate, well, not only does it look like black can castle, but he can play queen takes d1 check and win. So white doesn't have time to do that. So it looks like bishop takes e7 is not the right move order. What about taking the queen first and then trying to get down here? Like maybe queen takes, knight takes. And now we can't play rook to d8, but we can play rook to d6, threatening the knight. And if the knight moves, we have the mate. But maybe the knight can just go back into e7. And white's going to mop up the pawns and win the game, but as a tactic, that's not the big deal. So let's try the third permutation. What happens if we check with the rook first? Okay, well, if we just stop and say, I can't do that because I'm losing the rook, that's a quiescence error. So let's say he takes the rook. Did that get us anything? Oh, yes, it did. It got us a pinned knight. That means when I take the queen, he can't take back. And that's forced, so that must be the right answer. So the seeds of tactical destruction suggest that the three moves to look at are bishop takes e7, queen takes c6, and rook to d8. And indeed, the queen takes c6 wins, but rook d8 check wins much, much, much better. All right, number 72. Okay, this was in a tactics book that I bought. I can't remember the name of the book. But it's white to play. Well, what's white's problem? He's got a knight for a pawn, but the knight's pinned to his rook. So we're going to look for squares where right now the king and the rook can be attacked by forking on c5 or b8. The problem is if I move my knight, he'll take my rook. So I'm really looking for squares where I can fork him on d3 and a6. And that square is c5 or b4. But if I go to c6 and he plays rook takes and I play knight to b4, he takes me with the pawn, so that doesn't work. So I need to go to a square where I can go to c5, and I can't go to b3. So the only square left to go to is e6. And again, if you say I can't go knight e6 because he takes me with the pawn, that's a quiescence error. Knight e6 does the trick, because now I'm saving the knight. If he moves the rook to a random square, I can just take the pawn check. If he takes my knight, I take his rook. That's the quiescence error if you said knight e6 is no good. And the key, of course, is if he takes the rook, I take the pawn check. He comes up, I take the rook, and I have knight and two pawns against two pawns, and I'm winning. So that's the answer, knight to e6. Okay, number 75. Okay, this is where you have to make your own tactics. Black to play. What's the seed of tactical destruction for white? Well, one seed is that white is not castled and black is. Excuse me. Another seed is white has a lot of pieces in the middle where they can be attacked. And the answer is just play e5 hitting the bishop. If the bishop takes the pawn, then pin the bishop and start piling up on that pinned bishop. For instance, if he tries to guard it with a move like queen to g3, black should be able to play something like, maybe bishop to d6. Let's see what the computer says is the best move order here. Rook to e8. It says if queen g3, bishop d6, yep, and then if f4, you play knight h5, threatening the queen and threatening f6, and something's got to give. Computer says if queen f3 hitting the knight, just take off, remove the guard. Queen takes f4, bishop takes e5, wins. All right, and if e5, if the bishop saves himself and comes back bishop e3, then we get our fork with e4. So here, black's making his own tactic. He sees, I'll either get a pin or I'll get a fork. And it's all because white's not castled and he's got all those pieces lined up. All right, our last problem is number 78. Okay, again, this was in a puzzle book I saw a year or two ago. And I solved this pretty quickly. The seed that black has is his king only has a knight guarding it, and the white squares leading up to the king are vulnerable. So the obvious first move that you would look at, and again, this is something no good player would miss in a game, but lower rated players say, oh, I can't take that knight. Rooks are worth more than knights. But the first move a good player is going to look at here is, what happens if I play rook takes f3 and mess up his white squares around his king? And then you have to figure out what to do. Well, I've had several people say they solved this problem by rook takes f6, g takes f6, queen d3, and then made him on h7. And the answer is that's not correct. The reason it's not correct is black will simply throw the f-pawn in the way with f5. And after queen takes f5, he'll play f6, letting the queen on c7 guard h7. What do I mean by that? If you can't visualize it, rook takes f6, g takes f6, queen d3, f5, queen takes f5, f6, and the pawn's guarded. Also, on queen d3, black can just play something like rook e8, and then on queen checks start running the king around, although this is probably losing. So the right answer is rook takes f6, g takes f6, queen g4 check, and if king h8, then queen f5, and the king can't run and he can't sack the pawns. So that's the right answer. Rook takes f6, pawn takes, queen check. Don't stop when you see queen d3. It's not right. King h7, queen f5, blocking him completely in. And no matter what he does here, he could play queen h2 check and delay a move. But otherwise, it's checkmate. Okay, so today we've talked about the seeds of tactical destruction, things that are wrong with your position that can cause errors. As I said, there's an entire, I wrote Novice Nooks on this for Chess Cafe and done some videos. And as I said, there's a whole book on it, which is relatively advanced. It's not a beginner's book. It's called Tune Your Chess Tactics Antenna by Emmanuel Neiman. And in that book, he calls the seeds of tactical destruction signals, which is a good name too. All right, for our YouTube series, this is Dan Heisman. Hopefully you'll enjoy our series and come back and subscribe. See you next time. Bye.